unique elevation above the Klebanbitske Reservoir, south of Kostyantynivka, is a key stronghold, an insurmountable obstacle for the enemy's plans and for the occupiers to capture the city. The fiercest clashes of the battle, probably since the beginning of the full-scale invasion by the Rashists, are taking place north of Myrnohrad, between the two highways leading to Kramatorsk. There, an unceasing and round-the-clock battle is raging for the entire vast Pokrovsk defense district, and there is a significant increase in the pace of the war in the southern operational zone, particularly near Kamyanske and Stepnogorsk, as well as south of Orikhiv, where the enemy has concentrated powerful forces and resources in the sector. Hello everyone, this is the Operational Duty Review project from the SpetsCor editorial team to help you understand the geography of the front. As usual, we will be using the online map and deep state map. The developers of the resource have granted permission for its use in the program. And today our special correspondent is military observer Denys Popovich. Mr. Denys, welcome and thank you for joining us. Q. Hello. Since the beginning of September, there hasn't been a single day on the front when the number of combat engagements has dropped below 150. This figure peaked last Thursday, September 17th, when there were 223 combat engagements along the front line. And the Kostyantynivka direction is actually one of those where the Russians' attempts to storm the Ukrainian defensive line almost never stop, with the total length of this line here stretching over 50 kilometers. One way or another, from three sides, northeast, south and southwest, forces from at least two Russian combined arms armies, the 3rd and the 8th, as well as the 3rd Army Corps, are simultaneously pressing on Kostyantynivka. In the area of Chasiv Yar, there are separate regiments of the 98th Airborne Division and a whole host of newly formed separate rifle regiments with their battalions. One way or another, around the strategically important city of Kostyantynivka, currently situated at a significant distance of about 8 to 13 kilometers, the Russian forces have concentrated very substantial and formidable forces which are continuously and relentlessly attacking toward the city from several distinct directions at once. For quite a long time, I don't know, probably since around mid-August, I would say it seemed that in the Chasiv Yar area, the front line had almost frozen, but it still stretches as before further south from Novomarkove along the dried-up bed of the Siversky Donets-Donbass Canal, with a small salient south of Mayske about 1.5 kilometers wide. Then, in Chasiv Yar itself, as it has been for a long time, the front line runs along the western outskirts of the city through the micro-districts of Novopivnichny, Shevchenka, Stavkom, Dniprovsky, Workshop No. 2, and beyond the N32 highway. In fact, everything is as it has been for many months in a row, but this is a very mistaken, I would say, illusory impression, which is ensured solely by the resilience of our soldiers. After all, the Russians, as we have already mentioned today, mainly the 98th Airborne Division and the 200th Brigade, continue their relentless pressure. But it should be noted that at least below the N32 highway, all the dominant heights, the highest of which reach over 200 meters, are, at least for now, under the control of the armed forces of Ukraine. It is very difficult between Kostyantynivka and Toretsk, where, in fact, from the very beginning of spring, the Russians have significantly increased the intensity of the fighting, and it has not subsided even after the enemy's 51st Combined Arms Army was redeployed from this direction to Dobropilya. The most active fighting is now taking place in the area of Oleksandr, Shultain and Bila Hora, where the Russians are attacking along the T05-19 road. This road runs parallel to a railway line that leads toward the southeastern districts of Kostyantynivka, and here the main attacking Russian forces are the 4th Motorized Rifle Brigade, the 77th Motorized Rifle Regiment, and the 101st Motorized Rifle Regiment. The pressure here is, in fact, at the shortest distance from the line of contact to the districts of Kostyantynivka, which is currently, I would say, about 8.5 kilometers, no more. At the same time, to the south of the city, the Russian 150th Motorized Rifle Division is trying simultaneously from the southeast, south, and southwest to break through a huge and rather powerful Ukrainian defensive area which stretches from the N20 highway through Katarinivka, the settlement of Klebanbik, and further up past Plishchivka. A little further west of the N20 highway, this road from Donetsk, which goes through Kostyantynivka, then on to Kramatorsk and Kharkiv. Ukrainian soldiers, roughly at the level of Yablonivka and Oleksandr Kalinove, along this road on the N32 highway, about halfway between Novolenivka and Yablonivka, managed at least to somewhat slow down the advance of the Russians. This is very important because this entire area, from the south, from the west, leads to a completely dominant height over the area, above the Klebanbitske Reservoir. I dare to suggest that the outcome of the confrontation for this height, which we have already discussed more than once, will to a large extent determine the fate of the entire defense of Kostyantynivka in the long term. For more details about the situation in the Kostyantynivka direction, particularly in the sector south of the city, we have the opportunity to hear firsthand, I hope, from the Chief Sergeant of the 39th Separate Battalion of Unmanned Systems, 19th Army Corps, who is now connected with our studio. Radosa, welcome.
Good afternoon.
Before I start asking you questions, I want to address our viewers. You should see a QR code appear on your screens. This is for a fundraiser for off-road vehicles and additional equipment for the soldiers of the 39th Battalion of Unmanned Systems. Needless to say, these vehicles are desperately needed. They are hunted, they break down, and this is the kind of help our soldiers needed yesterday, as they say. So, if you have the opportunity, please join in and support our defenders. Radosa, tell me, about a month and a half ago we spoke here in this studio with your battalion commander about the operational situation south of Kostyantynivka. That was around the beginning of August, give or take. Since then, has the overall picture, the dynamics of the confrontation, the means and forces, and the situation in this sector changed in any way or not at all? And what does the daily reality of the war look like now on this section?
Yes, indeed, a month and a half ago, the situation south of Kostyantynivka looked quite different. If at the beginning of August the enemy was still trying to act more in a reconnaissance probing manner with small groups and occasional use of armored vehicles, now we are seeing a noticeable increase in intensity. In this sector, the enemy is using drones much more extensively, both for reconnaissance and for strike missions. These are not isolated incidents, but rather a systematic use of these means. Every single sortie undertaken by these assault groups, both the smaller and the larger ones, is consistently accompanied by entire swarms of unmanned aerial vehicles, commonly known as drones. At the same time, artillery is also actively operating, heavily shelling our positions. Our defense relies on the systematic use of unmanned systems and artillery. We spot the enemy in advance, and thanks to this, we are able to destroy them as they approach.
Is it just a false impression, or are the Muscovites really attacking mainly along the roads? And perhaps related to this, what does it mean that they are using, let's say, more wheeled rather than all-terrain vehicles? Or is it just our general impression?
No, the enemy really is concentrating its forces specifically in these directions near these roads. The very first and foremost reason, above all other considerations, is undoubtedly logistics. That is to say, the crucial ability to effectively deliver essential ammunition and vital supplies more easily and efficiently to where they are most needed. Secondly, even in extremely difficult and challenging weather conditions, the consistently hard and well-maintained surface of the roads significantly makes their overall movement much easier and more efficient. And yes, the enemy frequently uses a substantial number of various wheeled vehicles, specifically large trucks, robust Ural vehicles, and numerous modified civilian pickups, all of which are crucial for their logistical operations.
No matter how difficult things are here, I absolutely agree with you. It seems to me that the hardest and most intense fighting is now taking place precisely on the northeastern flank of the Pokrovsk salient, specifically along and around the N32 highway, north of Myrnohrad. Ukrainian soldiers managed to carry out a whole series of quite effective counterattacks here, particularly along the western bank of the Kazany-Torets River towards Razin and along the highway to the east, thus pushing the Russians back a bit from Novoye Ekonomichne and somewhat narrowing this bottleneck of the Russian incursion around Chasiv Yar between Volodymyrivka and Razin. Roughly the same thing was achieved a bit earlier by our troops between Mykhanorivka and Pankivka, largely thanks to the converging counterstrikes by Ukrainian forces, especially from the north and northeast. but literally on the eve, the Russians, with forces primarily from their 9th Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 51st Combined Arms Army, supported by the 39th Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 68th Army Corps, and it's possible that fighters from the 177th Separate Marine Regiment, which the Russians redeployed here at the end of last week, also took part, conducted a whole series of literally in the sense of mirrored counterattacks from the northwest, north, and east. At the very least, they managed to restore the status quo here somewhat, and at least delayed the possibility of their forces being fully encircled. The 114th and 132nd Brigades seem to be at the tip of this salient, and despite everything, they continued their attacks towards Krasny Lyman and Rodinsky with Beletsky. Obviously, the main task of the Russian command on the northeastern flank of the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration is to seize Myrnohrad from the northeast as deeply as possible and at least cut off or take full fire control over the T05-15 highway, which is the main route connecting Pokrovsk in the northern direction and its branch that passes through Hryshyn. Clearly, the order to cut these routes or take them under fire control for the enemy's troop grouping, the center for their 51st Combined Arms Army, has not been cancelled. A few more details about the events around Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad. I hope we will now hear firsthand from the commander of the mortar battery of the 68th Separate Jaeger Brigade, named after Oleksandr Reno, who is joining us live in the studio. Reno, welcome.
Hello.
Once again, I want to draw our viewers' attention, before we start talking with our soldiers, to the QR code you see on your screens. This is a fundraiser for vehicle repairs. It is very important to repair this equipment. Once again, these vehicles are not indestructible. The enemy is hunting them, so please, if you can, join in supporting our soldiers. Reno, tell us, first of all, the combat clashes currently happening in the sector. Are these battles taking place inside Pokrovsk itself, or are they still on the southwestern, southern, and southeastern outskirts of the city?
The area corresponding to the 68th Jaeger Brigade is still a battle on the approaches to Pokrovsk. But in that zone, which you discussed with Viroveli, Ontovich, and Trianda, essentially the border of Pokrovsk directly adjoins these settlements, we have evidence that the enemy regularly, in small groups of 1 or 2, enters there and, so to speak, wedges themselves right up to the edge of Pokrovsk. Our forces try to destroy and clear them out, but periodically this situation repeats itself. There are days when they are present there with a certain number of personnel.
If we compare all of last August and the 2nd and 3rd of September that have already passed, in terms of the assault activity of the Muscovites, is the nature of the enemy's actions and the forces and means they are deploying in the Pokrovsk direction similar to those previous periods? Or have there now appeared any significant differences?
Since about mid-August, the activity of enemy groups targeting logistics has intensified significantly. The enemy's Rubicon unit is working much more intensively, primarily focusing on logistics. Since mid-August, the situation with logistics in Pokrovsk has worsened considerably. That is, entry into the city and to the positions is now very difficult, and according to the videos the enemy is posting, it is specifically Rubicon that is operating there.
Let me clarify, these are mostly strikes by the Muscovites, mainly targeting the rear areas, that is north and northwest of Pokrovsk. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yes. Specifically, the activity on the northern outskirts has intensified, and this has led to complications with logistics. That is, if the work on the front line was ongoing and continues as before, we had already become somewhat accustomed to it, using electronic warfare, alternative routes, and demining teams. Then the activity on the northern outskirts has seriously complicated logistics. In other words, the distance that has to be covered on foot has unfortunately decreased.
Rhino, tell us, how significant do enemy long-range artillery systems remain as a factor on this section right now?
Well, I would say that right now the bigger problem is actually the enemy's use of FPV drones and remote mining. In other words, the work of KBs and artillery. Let's put it this way, unfortunately, we've come to accept that as the norm. But this is a new factor that complicates logistics and forces us to look for appropriate countermeasures against the enemy's new tactics.
At the end of the first 10 days of September, there were reports that the Russians had moved and were concentrating all their combat-ready, at least marine units south of Moji, Pokrovsk, and Myrnohrad. That is, into the area of the enemy's central military grouping. They are supposedly moving them there to reinforce it. Do you have confirmation of this information, or, in your opinion, could this indirectly indicate that the Russians are preparing for some kind of massive, relentless assault on Pokrovsk, Myrnohrad from the south, or is this not accurate?
Based on the information I have, the same units that have been assaulting us for the past month and a half are continuing their assault operations. In other words, we have not detected any new units, and at least as far as the enemy's immediate rear is concerned, we do not have any such information.
Rhino, thank you very much for finding the opportunity and time to answer our questions. Please take care of yourself and your soldiers. Thank you. Should we expect another attempt by the Russians to attack from the north to try again to advance toward the 0514 highway, which runs through Pokrovsk, through Dobropilya, and leads to Kramatorsk?
I think that the whole story started with Mr. Manko's statement, blaming the head of the Problynistru Mufiysk armaments of the armed forces of Ukraine about 3 cauldrons. Obviously, he meant Vusk, that is, between the new Shakov and Shakov-Volodymyrik, Pankivka. Clearly, this is the large Novotoresk, Razny, Fedorov. Obviously, that's what he had in mind, as we can see. This does not exist. And the information on the ground also indicates that this does not exist. The encirclement has not worked out for us there yet, but there are prospects for this. That is, there is a possibility that we will be able to encircle a unit of Russian troops there, despite the fact that they significantly outnumber us. I think that right now their task is to prevent the threat of encirclement one way or another. At the same time, their current objective is to advance toward Rodinske, as paradoxical as it may sound, toward Krasny Lyman, and generally to keep moving forward. Again, it's about the route logistics and the 51st Army, which has been assigned this task. They are also counting on sending in units that are positioned in the rear. In other words, they will try to prevent us from encircling them.
Can you provide more details about what's happening in the sectors south and southeast of Orikhiv and on another hot spot in Zaporizhia? We have the opportunity to ask our military correspondent, Ruslan Yermolyuk, who is now live with us in the studio. Ruslan, hello. In the first 10 days of September, there were attempts by the Russians to approach Orikhiv from the south, from Robotyne through Mali Tokmachka. Is this pressure continuing now? And do you have any information about what's happening in the area of Stepnogorsk and Kamyanske? Because the information is very contradictory.
Hello, Sasha. The situation is actually difficult in the Orikhiv direction, as the occupiers are using mechanized units in their offensives. Recently there was one such assault. The enemy tried to advance from 3 directions, z Nesteryanka, from Robotyne and from Novopokrovka towards the area of Mala Tokmachka. The occupiers used tanks, mine-clearing vehicles, BMPs and APCs. Fortunately, this column was destroyed, but the enemy keeps probing for weak spots in our defense, particularly moving towards Nova Danilivka along this road. In particular, today and yesterday, new assaults were spotted using buggies and armored personnel carriers. The assaults were repelled, and successfully so, but the occupiers are not giving up hope of finding a gap at the junctions of our battalions or brigades to try to press harder. The situation is also difficult near Malisherbaki and near Stepnogorsk. The enemy from Kamyanske is pressing on Stepnogorsk. Right now, this town is in the gray zone, located on high ground. The occupiers have made advances near the town, and DRG sabotage and reconnaissance groups have already been spotted in Stepnogorsk. Fortunately, our fighters are eliminating them, but the enemy has picked up the pace of their advance and is now moving along the railway towards Stepnogorsk, trying to reach the commanding heights to, so to speak, secure a foothold and then push further towards Zaporizhia itself and the flanks. Returning to Orikhiv, the situation is quite difficult, as these flanking maneuvers threaten our entire grouping in Orikhiv, since the enemy is now trying to cut our logistics, using all types of drones to do so, trying to destroy both military personnel and various vehicles. That's why part of the logistics is now being covered by ground drones. Direct speech follows. Speech.
There really are a huge number of drones. When the enemy is planning something in a certain direction, I think they first send in scouts and directly FPV pilots, Mavic pilots. So I believe that these units have now come in specifically to assess the situation and directly complicate our logistics and the delivery of replacements and rotations at the positions. That's why right now we're seeing a very, very high number of FPV drones. The tactics haven't changed. Without any artillery shelling or preparatory fire, they just drive up in vehicles and try to break through, to literally throw themselves into our defenses, jump into the trenches, and then try to develop their success by securing a foothold right in the trenches.
However, there are so many drones in the air, and I experienced this myself when we were in Orikhiv. In reality, the city is covered with netting, but there are still a huge number of drones, and their numbers are increasing. Our military reports that the occupiers are building up forces from the direction of Polohi, and they are recording the arrival of Russian paratroopers and special forces. The occupiers are preparing and do not stop attacking. They storm in small groups, again just 1 or 2 people at a time, trying to gain a foothold, build up their numbers and advance further.
Voslin started talking about this, that in the Orikhiv-Tokmak operational zone, the occupiers have concentrated a certain amount of forces and resources in order to sharply increase the intensity of the fighting or to force us to redeploy our reserves. Or maybe there's nothing major there, and it will just be a local tactical battle meant to distract the attention of our headquarters.
To distract attention, since they understand that we have few reserves, that's the first thing. Second, advancing towards Zaporizhia, the whole area there is like that. Anyone who's been there knows it's all hills, in some places even resembling a serpentine road. That's the impression you get.
Right at the precise elevation where they are currently positioned, and further on, moving towards Balaban.
That's Zaporizhia.
In other words,
this is the area leading up to Zaporizhia. It's basically the entrance to Zaporizhia. So having control of these heights gives them the opportunity to keep harassing the city further, without actually advancing on it right now. At the moment, they have time until the beginning of winter, which we simply don't have. But they can create conditions so that later, maybe in the winter or at the beginning of next spring or even later, they could try to put direct pressure on Zaporizhia. Right now, they might be setting such objectives for themselves. Although, I want to repeat again, the outcome of the current campaign was decided near Pokrovsk. As of today, I think they don't have enough reserves for such an operation against Zaporizhia, but in the future, if they accomplish their objectives in the east, it could become possible.
That's all for now. Our on-duty guest in the studio of SpetsCor today was military observer Denys Popovich. Once again, thank you for the insightful conversation, as always. On that note, we'll put an ellipsis here, and we'll definitely continue. Take care of yourselves, and we'll certainly see you again.